for Sarah, who's taken some well-deserved leave. So very lucky to have a new recruit to Griffith. So Francois, is it
Carrillat, yes.
Yes, okay, excellent. I got off to a good start there. So Francois has recently joined the Department of Marketing here at Griffith. So he's also joined GIFT. So we're very pleased to have him present to us today. So as his background, he is of course now a professor of marketing here with us at Griffith University. Prior to his current appointment, Francois held positions at UTS and also in Montreal. A large part of his research focuses on event sponsorship. And I certainly know that because I have cited your work, Francois, in my own publications.
Okay.
Celebrity endorsers.
I was you.
No, I'm sure there were others. Influencers, while also being interested in consumer well-being, entertainment marketing, and advertising. So a lot of that expertise, of course, is very much directed to today's topic that Francois will be presenting on. Up on the screen. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Francois. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Sorry about the little delay, but we should be on time. There's a bit of flexibility in the presentation, I think. So that should be all right. We still have time for questions at the end. I guess it's easier with the bimodal presentation to have questions at the end. Anyway, so yes, presentation will be at the intersection of advertising, events, sporting event, and a little bit of sponsorship, but not entirely about sponsorship. So response to event advertising typicality during major sporting events under short exposures. Short exposures as in when consumers are exposed to advertising or advertisements for very brief periods of time. So I'm talking about seconds, half a second, 1/10 of a second. So you will see exactly what that means as I move along. This project has been ongoing for quite some time. I think 6 years. We have been working on this for 6 years with Marc Mazaudier from ESSEC Business School in France and Christine Eckert, who was my colleague at UTS for 7 years, and now she's also she has this appointment in Germany as well. And this is just about to be resubmitted to the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science. So it should be resubmitted within 4 days, actually. So there's a hard deadline pressing on us. So this is very fresh on my mind. I've been working on this very intensely in the last few days. So what do we mean by event advertising? We mean things like this. So it just this research started from that observation that sometimes advertisers like to evoke a particular sporting event. So those examples are in French, but it doesn't matter. You get the idea, right? So this was an event typical ad just before and during the World Cup in Russia in 2018. So it's typical of the event because we've got some visual elements that are archetypical of both Russia and soccer, right? We've got the soccer ball, we've got the doll, from large to small, and of course there's a bit of reference to the product category. But interestingly, in this example, the product category is evoked in a very subtle way. Usually airlines, when they advertise their services, it's very simple. They show a sky and they show a plane, right? So that's a typical product category for airlines. Here it's not typical of the product category, it's just typical of a sporting event. So very interesting. Bottom, same example, just in a different product category. Financial services, Visa, again, no big credit card, no banks whatsoever, just pictures or visuals typical of the World Cup, same event. But there are also examples as well where the ad will be typical of the of an event. So this is typical of a different event. This is here about the 2014, or in fact the 2016 Olympics in Rio, and it's typical because of the yellow and green. And of course, this is a Brazil edition of the Valentine's alcohol drink. But unlike the first two examples, which is also typical of another thing, which is a product category, because there is a big bottle in the middle in a glass. And in a very simple way, when advertisers want to be typical of the beverage product category, what do? They put a big picture of whatever is the container of the beverage. So this one is typical of both an event and a product category, and so is this one. Those last two examples, I just saw them just randomly walking around in Hungary. The last example, this one, Gelatinho, very creative way to be an event typical of the Soccer World Cup. This is just a local gelato shop in Hungary. And you can see Jesus the Redeemer has been repurposed a little bit. Seems to enjoy his ice cream. He even has a nickname like a Brazilian soccer player could have, Gelatinho, possibly it's possible. Anyway, so that's the idea. So what can we, as advertisers, what do they do to evoke the event through typical elements? And so that's our observation. And so that's interesting because what we know about advertising typicality does not include at all ads that are typical of sporting events. Advertising typicality means, up to now, means one thing and one thing only. It's our ads that are typical of a product category, how do they perform? And so, you want to sell a can of Coke, you put a big can of Coke on the ad. You want to sell a car, you put a car in a road, big one on the ad. And this works really well, advertising typicality, when you expect consumers or viewers to look at the ad for a very short period of time, for less than 5 seconds, which in fact is 90% of the encounter with ads last less than 5 seconds. And so that's a bit of the paradox and an issue. In fact, advertisers, creatives, they like to be creative with ads, and often you will need more than 5 seconds to really get the gist of the ad when there's something subtle in the ad. But 90% of the time, viewers don't have time to process the entire ad. So the big benefit of product typicality is that people get it very quickly. In fact, the studies and the research by Vedel and colleagues shows that people get what the product category is, they even understand what the brand is, and they even develop positive attitude towards the brand when it is typical of the product category, the ad, in 100 milliseconds, 1/10 of a second, which is less than an average eye fixation. The eye, to fixate on something, will fixate for a quarter of a second. So less than that is enough for the human eye to recognize the product category, the brand, and even develop some attitude, positive attitude towards the brand if the ad is effective. And so this is just an example. This is an ad very typical of the pizza category. No surprise, you show a big pizza, and it works very well. It's very simple, but it works very well at short exposure times. And if you want to be a bit more creative, you can show the slice of a pizza in a more allegorical way if you want, or metaphorical way. Okay, I'll show you other examples. So in a nutshell, what we know about advertising typicality so far, if you see the solid line at the top of this graph, so this is the extent to which people like, or consumers like, the ad that they see as a function of different exposure duration. So, 100 milliseconds, which is 1/10 of a second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, so very short. This is from the research of Peters and Wedell. And then when you go beyond 5 seconds, this is considered a very different processing mode, which is called the thick slicing mode. because you can really process the entire ad in 5 seconds or more. So what's interesting is that what they call upfront, I call product typical. So the upfront, which is a solid line at the top, even at 100 milliseconds, it starts as the best, and it remains basically the best performing ad across the continuum of exposure durations. The mystery ad, which I call, in a simpler way, the atypical ad, starts as the worst, if you want, with 100 milliseconds, but then you can see really progressively, linearly, in fact, it improves with exposure duration, okay? And in fact, at the end, at 30 seconds, there is no more significant difference between the product typical and the atypical. You can see the confidence intervals overlap quite a bit at 30 seconds. So what does that mean? Basically, if you expect consumers to look at your ads for a very short period of time, which is 90% of the time, you should make your ads product typical. It's only if you expect that consumers will have the time or take the time, in fact, you need both conditions. They need to have the capacity and the opportunity to look at the ads for 30 seconds. Then atypical might also work, but not even better than typical, product typical. And so we were interested in, can we find, or is the practice of sporting event typicality, is it in fact a better typical, is it a better typicality than product typicality for advertising effectiveness? Okay. And so, why do they work so well, those product typical ads? Well, it's simply because the perceptual features or the visual elements of the ad, they are diagnostic of the product category. So, for product categories that are very common, like automotives, consumers, because they are so used to ads and the product, they used to use the product, lots of people have cars, they have in their mind very strong association with what's typical of that product category. Well, a car on the road. So if you show that, people will think about the category right away, and that will make it easy to process the ad, and whatever is easy to do, generate positive attitude. This ad is easy to process because it's product typical. Therefore, I feel happy. Therefore, I like the ad in a very simple way. And the atypical ad or mystery ad, that's the complete opposite, as you understand. So the true identity of the ad is not revealed immediately, certainly not in 1/10 of a second, maybe not even in 1 second, maybe 2 or 3, 5 probably okay. So this is an ad for Mercedes, and the different parts of the car make up for driver, basically. So event typical ad, what do we mean by that? So basically we just mean, by analogy with product typical, it's an ad that features elements strongly associated with the visual imagery of an event, whatever that sporting event is. We look at sporting event only, but it could be other types of events, as long as they are popular, of course. So there's one research by my co-author who looked at the effectiveness of event typical ads, but in a context of fixed slice exposure, so with unlimited time to look at the ads. But what we are really interested is, can event typical ad outperform product typical ad at short exposure times? Because those product typical times at short exposures, they are the gold standard for advertising effectiveness. And this was not done by Mark Mazzoli and his colleagues. To compare event typical and product typical, they did not do that, and they did not look at short exposures, which we will look at. So going back to my first examples, they are ads that are not only just not just event typical, they are also typical of the product category. So we call them dual typical. Really what that means is that they evoke two cognitive schemas, the one of the event and the one of the product category. And that's very interesting also from a theoretical standpoint, because there's just, in this case, there's no research at all on ads that are typical of two things instead of being typical of one thing. We just don't know anything about it. So because of that void or gap, I just lost the picture. It's back. Hopefully you still see it as well. So we did a bit of an exploratory research, and we asked experts in academia and industry what they thought would be the best ads in terms of advertising effectiveness. So we showed them 4 different types of ads. We gave definition, we showed examples, many examples, and we showed them 4 types. So the ad that is event typical, the ad that is dual typical, the ad that's typical of the product only, and the ad that's typical of nothing, the atypical one. And we asked them to rank the ads 1, 2, 3, 4 from best to worst. Those are the descriptive results. And basically what came out of this is that all those experts, whether or not they were academics or industry people, they all agreed that dual typical should be the best. Because after all, it's typical of 2 things, and typicality seems to be a good thing. And so the idea is that those benefits are additive. And so the dual typical might, after all, maybe is the best. And so we shall see how it turns out. I think if you read the abstract, is already the answer to that. But that was interesting that to us that experts basically believe dual typical will be the best. So our research questions, how do event typical ads compare with product category typical ads at short exposures or thin slice exposure? And then how's the dual typical ads? Do they accumulate benefits from both typicalities, the event typicality and the product typicality? So that's also what we want to find out. And the third research question is related to the underlying psychological processes, because for the type of journal we wanted to submit this, they always ask, if you get some nice effect, they always ask, but why? And so the third bullet point is about why. And the why here is that we believe, and I will explain the theory as I go through the studies, is that curiosity and attribute transfer from the event explain why the event typical should be working pretty well. And curiosity and attribute transfer, there are new mechanisms to the literature. We believe it will be in addition to the mechanism that has already been shown about the feeling of knowing. I remember when I said the product typical ad works well because it's an easy one to process. And well, that easy feeling comes from the fact that people feel confident that what they know or understand about the ad is accurate. So when you feel that you feel confident about what you know, this is more precisely what I meant about that pleasant feeling of or ease of processing the ad. So that's actually 3 mechanisms, one already shown in the literature. We are saying that in fact you need 2 more to account for all the effects. So this is a framework. I won't go through all of this. This is basically a picture of what I just said in the last 15 minutes. And it's basically a bit of decision tree on the left-hand side. So is it typical of the product category? Yes, no. Then is it typical of an event? Yes, no. So depending on your answers to those yes, no questions, you get your 4 types of ads, So you see the ad types in the middle, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you've got the 3 mechanisms I just talked about, feeling of knowing, attribute transfer, curiosity. And from those mechanisms, you have the outcomes for the brand. So we look at 2 outcomes in our empirical studies. The first one is attitude towards the brand in the ad. And then the other one is brand choice, which we'll show in the last study. Okay. All right, so study 1. I got quite a few studies, but their designs are quite similar. So I'll spend more time on the first one, and then we can go faster after that. So the first study, we did it in the lab. So it was done at UTS in the behavioral lab, actually. We had about 268 students in sessions of 15. I'm the one who collected the data, so I remember very well. And what's important here is that we manipulated between subject, the exposure time. So you need like a specialist software to do that. We use JPSych that they use in visual research in psychology. So we manipulated 3 durations, 100 milliseconds, 2 seconds. 2 seconds is interesting because it's a bit more than 2 eye fixations. And 5 seconds is interesting because it's the border between thin and thick slicing. Then we manipulated, of course, product category, typical or atypical, and of course, if it's typical or not of a sporting event. So the last 2 factors were manipulated within subjects. Okay, so we had only one factor manipulated between subjects, which is exposure time. So in fact, in each between subject condition, we had about 90 respondents. And also what's important is that it's a total number of ads that each respondent see and writes. And so we had 24 ads for each respondent because you can see it's 4 types of ad, of course. But for each type, we have 2 replicates just to make sure we can generalize beyond just one type of ad or one exemplar of one ad type. So 2 replicates, and we also use 3 different product categories in each of the ad types. So it's 4 times 3, and then 2 replicates times 2, 24 ads. So that's, I should spare you the details, but it took about 2 years just to develop the ads. So that was, yeah, long and complicated, but I'll just show you the final pretest. DV is very classical here, attitude towards the ad, interest towards the ad, attitude towards the brand. Because regardless of which DV we use, the results are almost exactly the same. I just show the result for attitude towards the ad. It just doesn't matter which one I will show. Okay. So just to give you an idea of the stimuli we use. So this is an ad that's very typical of the skincare category. Of course, we have a face with skin, and it's not typical of any event whatsoever. We have here event typical because it's not typical of the car category. I can't see a road, I can't see a car at all, but it is typical of the Rio Olympics. We can see that we have starting blocks, except that we can see the skid marks of the tires instead of a runner coming off the starting blocks, and the tagline, full throttle to Rio. So that's event typical. Atypical, typical of nothing. So here, no car, no road. That's an ad for Fiat, but no car, no road, and no event whatsoever. So here, it's a word play on the new paint finish of the Fiat. So they use that sort of metaphor with the black bear inside the polar bear and the dark side of personality. This one is a dual typical, so it's typical of the product category for beverages because the biggest thing here is a bottle of Gatorade, but we also have the Pano de Azúcar in the Bay of Rio, Copacabana Beach. We even have a track and field and the tagline to finish thirst in Rio. So this one is dual typical. So we had 24 of those. Pre-test, I won't go through the numbers and details, but what we wanted, of course, is that the manipulation works. So whatever is supposed to be high on product category typicality is higher than whatever is supposed to be low. And same thing with event typicality. So that works pretty well. And what was also important for this research, we wanted to control for differences between the ads, but other than product and event typicality. So all the ads have the same level of complexity, visual complexity. They have the same picture text relevance or the coherence between the copy and the visuals. The familiarity of the brands, because you can see we use real brands, so there's always that question of if some brands are more known than others, what's going to happen. So There's no difference on brand familiarity, and visual complexity as well is the same. So visual complexity, we didn't use a self-reported measure because people in visual research don't use that. They use compression rate of the file of the ad. So you compress the file of the ad, the JPEG or whatever is the type of file with a software to compress it. And it doesn't matter what number you get, but you want the compression rate to be the same for every ad because more complex ads are harder to compress. So it's an objective measure, if you want, of visual complexity. So here we are all in the ballpark of 50-something%, and it's not significantly different. So I won't spend as much time on the other pretests because they are all very, very similar. I won't go through the details again of the regression results. I'll go to the more substantive interpretation of the results. Basically, what we have is a three-way interaction between event typicality, product typicality, and exposure duration. So three-way interactions are not the easiest to interpret. That's why I'm going to break it down for you carefully to see what this all means. Also, a little aside, to analyze our data, we didn't do an ANOVA, we did a BANOVA with a B because we have 24 ads per respondent, so every participant in the experiment rated 24 times, right? And so that's a design with a lot of repetition, and what's best in that case is to model the individual effects. And so Bayesian, that's what the B stands for in BANOVA, Bayesian analysis of variance allows you to do that, which ANOVA doesn't allow you to do that. So that was it's a very recent development in ANOVA by Michel Vedel and his former PhD student. Okay, so results. And so what does that mean? So we've got, if you look on the left-hand side of the graph, at 1/10 of a second, you can see that the ad or the ads that are the most effective at this very short duration are the event typical and the product typical. So they are not significantly different. You can see the gray one and the small dot line. It's product typical and event typical. They are not significantly different. But then the gray line, as you can see, is very similar to the first graph I showed from the Wedel's paper. The gray line doesn't go up. It stays flat across the duration. So people like product typical ad right away, but then it doesn't matter if they look at it for 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 30 seconds. Their liking for it does not change. So they like it straight away, but it doesn't improve. But then what's really interesting is that for the event typical ad, the improvement in comparison to product typical is very steep. And you can see from 100 milli to 2 seconds, the slope is quite steep for the event typical. The slope for the atypical is also very steep. In fact, it's so steep that it goes from the worst performing ad at 1/10 of a second. Now I'm talking about the black solid line here. It goes from the worst ad at 100 milli to basically it's a tie with event typical at 2 seconds. And then if we look at 5 seconds, then the event typical keeps improving a little bit. And for the atypical one, in fact, it declines a little bit. So much so that at 5 seconds, event typical is significantly better than atypical. So the small dots line is significantly higher than the solid black line. And also regarding the research question about dual typical ads, which is like this, dash line, I would call it, is very disappointing. In fact, it's really never the best performing ad. It's the second worst ad at every single duration time. So dual typical doesn't seem to be a winning combination. Well, that's encouraging for us. We did a replication study. We just wanted to confirm that. Very similar, same everything in the lab with students at UTS, everything the same, except that we dropped 5 seconds because we are more interested in staying within that very short exposure times. So we dropped 5 seconds, and we added alpha second, which is 500 milliseconds. Why? Because we wanted to know, well, we can see that most of the change from the previous study, and we can see most of the change happened between 1/10 of a second and 2 seconds. But where exactly? Is it between 500 milliseconds and 2 seconds? Is it between 1/10 and alpha second? Empirical question. So we thought, let's manipulate, or let's add the 500 milliseconds condition, and we'll see. Everything else is the same, 24 ads, the same ads, in fact. And in fact, we get the exact same results. The 500 milliseconds shows the exact same result as the 100 milliseconds. So the moderating effect of exposure time really kicks in between alpha second and 2 seconds, not between 100 milli and 500 milli. It's after 500 milliseconds. We suspect, we didn't test it because we focused on other things, but we suspect that this is maybe at 3 or 4 eye fixations that this happens, because usually we have like 2 or 3 visual elements of the event. So that would be at 3/4 of a second and after. But it's more of an empirical question, so we focus more on the theoretical thing in the next studies, which I'm about to show you. So again, the designs are very similar between the studies. So I'll focus on what's really different in each study. So in study 2, what we did that is different, 2 things. The first thing is that we use the same brand in all the ads, because although we did that pre-test and everything, you could always argue, well, but okay, you measure brand familiarity, but there are other things than brand familiarity. The color schemes are not exactly the same, whatever. So we use the same brand in every ad this time, so no issue with that. And of course, we measured the process that I was talking about earlier, the feeling of knowing. We measured, so feeling of knowing, just a word about how we measure that. Basically, we ask viewers, after they see the ad, we ask them to tell us what they think is the dominant or main theme, or general theme of the ad. And then we give them options. Some of them are correct, some of them are incorrect. Okay, so when they look at the Olympic ads, we give, they should answer Olympic Games and not FIFA World Cup or Wimbledon or something else, or a product category, right? And then after they answer that, we ask them how confident they are that their response to the previous question is correct. And that, in fact, this second answer is the measure of the feeling of knowing. We don't care if what the answer is correct. We care about, do they feel confident about it? So it's a subjective measure. It's not an objective measure of knowing. Okay, it's a feeling of knowing. Attribute transfer. So what we did another pretest, which I'm not going to show, but tell you the result. Basically, the 2 attributes the most strongly associated with the Olympics are iconic and popular. And so we measured those iconic and popular with the brand in the ad, and we looked at does the difference between iconic and popular about the brand and about the event, does this difference decrease after viewing the ad? Okay, and of course we measure this process, and we want to see if exposure time will make this attribute transfer process stronger for the event typical ad. We believe with more time there will be more opportunity for attribute transfer. And then curiosity is a very simple question. Do you feel curious about the ad? That's very straightforward. Measure 1 item, validated in previous research. Same thing, we believe curiosity, the strength of this effect will be contingent on exposure time. So those are the stimuli for study 2. So it's Volvo in every ad. We use the same ad as studies 1A, 1B, except that we Photoshopped the brand and we put Volvo in every ad. Not us, a pro, I didn't say that, but all the ads were designed by a professional graphic designer. In a nutshell, I know it's a lot of graphs. I'm only going to focus for study 2 on the effect of the ads on the mediators or the processes. So you can see for the feeling of knowing here, what's interesting is that the event typical ad doesn't have a very strong feeling of knowing. That's a dotted line again at 100 milliseconds. But then the feeling of knowing, just like the atypical ad, increases very quickly at 2 seconds. The other two ads, product typical and dual typical, they have a very high feeling of knowing from 1/10 per second. Attribute transfer, I'm moving on the right-hand side. Attribute transfer is definitely same level. It's very interesting. Same level at 1/10 of a second for the two ad types that are actually typical of the event, dual typical and event typical. But at 2 seconds, attribute transfer keeps strengthening for the event typical ad, but it stays the same for dual typical. So there is something for the dual typical that prevents the attribute transfer from strengthening with more exposure time. And then curiosity, what's interesting as well is that for both ads, I'm at the bottom left, for both ads with which are not product typical, which are the atypical and the event typical, for both of them, their curiosity increases a lot with more exposure time, and for the other ads, the curiosity does not increase with more exposure time. What's also interesting is that even at 1/10 of a second, people feel more curious about the event typical ad than about the ad that's not typical of anything. We believe that at 1/10 of a second, to be curious, it's not, when you are curious, it's not like you don't have a clue. You need to have a little bit of a clue. In fact, people talk about Juan et al. and Lowenstein in behavioral psychology talk about curiosity as being in an almost knowing state. So atypical, at 1/10 of a second, you are not in an almost knowing state. You are in a I have no clue state. And so curiosity is very low at 1/10 of a second. But then at 2 seconds, you have enough time to, well, you're almost getting this ad with the base. If you only showed you the ad for 1 more second, maybe you will have got it. You know, that's kind of a feeling you get. For the event typical ad, it's faster to really reach that almost knowing state, which really is a trigger for curiosity. So in the next study, it's similar. We measure the processes. We use a different event, however. So instead of doing the Olympics, we did it during the Wimbledon Championships. So the ads, as you can see, have been designed accordingly. Okay. So what's also interesting here is that it's a fictitious brand. So it's the same brand in every ad, but it's fictitious. Before it was the same, but not fictitious. So here we are really removing any kind of preconceptions that respondents could bring with them during the experiment. And here I'm going to show you not just the effect on the mediators, I will show you the indirect effects of when you compare specific pairs of ads. And so, you know, I'm going to jump directly to the so-called indirect effect. If you look at the main effects, they are very similar from the previous studies. So at 1/10 of a second, product and event typical are very similar. Then at 2 seconds, product or event typical starts to be the best. Dual typical has like lackluster performance, and atypical improves the most from 100 to 2 seconds, but does not outperform event typical. So it's very similar. But what about the processes? So we operationalize the processes with those indirect effects. So there are 4 panels because we compare 4 different pairs of ads. We want to know panel A, we want to know if event typical, we want to know what processes drive the comparison of the effect on attitude towards the ad between event typical and product typical. And what you can see is that there's a huge effect from attribute transfer. So, you know, the gray vertical bar, right? Panel A is very high, 3 stars, very significant, very strong. So it means that the indirect effect of attribute transfer is positive, and because it's event versus product, it means it's in favor of the event typical ad. So of course, the event typical ad, you know, produces its effect through the indirect effect of attribute transfer in comparison to product typical. And you can see the white bar, this is a feeling of knowing. Of course, the feeling of knowing is a lot lower for the event typical ad, right? At 100 milliseconds or 2 seconds in comparison to product typical. So it's interesting because we really have those two opposite effects going on. So, but the attribute transfer one, as you can see from the bar is higher, the gray bar is higher, right, than the white one. And so the positive indirect effect of attribute transfer is stronger than the negative indirect effect of feeling of knowing, which explains why event typical performs better overall than product typical. So if I move to panel B, event typical versus dual typical, it's also a story about attribute transfer. At 100 milliseconds, the indirect effects, you can see directionally where they are going, but they are not significant. And then at 2 seconds, again, event typical, you know, shines thanks to attribute transfer in comparison this time to dual typical. If we compare event typical to atypical, here the event typical has two advantages in terms of indirect effect over the atypical ad, which it has a better attribute transfer, of course, because the atypical ad is not typical of the event. And it also has a better feeling of knowing. Okay, and the attribute transfer again strengthens in favor of the atypical ad when we go to 2 second exposures. If we compare product typical ad to the dual typical ad, this is a very interesting comparison because product typical is like the benchmark. We can see that it's got product typical as an advantage in terms of feeling of knowing at 100 milliseconds, but that advantage dissipates after longer exposures. So basically, to sum up that story about the indirect effect of the processes, it tells us that you do need to account for all three to explain all the effects, not just the feeling of knowing. You need curiosity as well. You also need attribute transfer. So we did a follow-up to that study. We wanted to see if the superiority of event typical ads would translate in terms of click-through rate in the real world, so to speak. So we did an experiment on using the Facebook A/B testing option. I'll spare you the details. The response were from Great Britain. They were interested in tennis. It was done during the Wimbledon Championships in 2021 and 2022. And so what we can see is the long story, the short story, is that the chances of somebody clicking on an event typical ad. So we use the same stimuli as I showed you before for the Wimbledon. The chances are basically 1.5 times larger if the ad is event typical than if it is dual typical or atypical. The chances are also larger in comparison to product typical, but it did not reach statistical significance. And yeah, so that translates to cost per clicks. You can see that the lowest cost per click is with the event typical. It's pretty steep decrease in cost. In fact, it's something like 25 to 30%, depending on which ad you compare event typical with. So it looks like it's working in the real world as well. We click-through rate. One more study. We wanted to this time check if it works with so-called behavioral measure. So it's an incentive aligned choice study. So it's not about attitude here. We asked people to, we told them that there will be a random draw, and they could, they could win a T-shirt of the brand of their choice. So they had to choose between two brands. One brand was a brand that was featured in each of the ads. Again, we use the same brand in each ad. And the other alternative brand was a brand from the same category, but was not featured in the target ads. Although we showed an ad for it, just to make sure it was equivalent from that standpoint, but they were not event typical ads, they were just regular ads. And that was done during the FIFA World Cup in December, so very recent data. Same thing, we manipulated again similar exposure time, so I won't repeat that. And those are the stimuli. So with those stimuli, that was very even more complicated to develop. We wanted to manipulate high-low event typicality with something, with only one thing. And so you can see in the event typical condition, you've got those silhouettes of soccer players, blue and red. So it's subtle. It's like, it's very subtle. And then for the other type of ad, we have more neutral, but very similar shape. It's the same surface area, same color. But of course, it's not about soccer or it's not about sport. And then for the product typicality, it was a bit difficult to find something very subtle to manipulate it. But it turns out that with APARs, a typical way to show models is to show them from the front. But a very atypical way is to show them from the back. So this is what we did in the event typical and atypical. And that worked very well. I won't show you the pre-test results. So essentially what we find, the best is probably to look at the table. What we find is that the brand choice is by far the highest with the event typical ad. So at alpha second, event typical ad versus whatever was the ad or the alternative brand, you got a 61 to 39% choice share. And then the highest one is for product typical 53, 47. Then at 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds, that increases to 80% choice share in the event typical, and the product typical is still at about 53, 54%. So even when we use behavioral measures, again, we find that event typical outperforms product typical. And again, we measured the processes. This is very similar to what we found before. The only difference here is that because the DV this time is choice, this is actually, those indirect effects are with two mediators. So one of them is brand attitude, and then before that is feeling of knowing, curiosity, and attribute transfer, because brand attitude will be located between those more fundamental mechanisms of curiosity, attribute, and feeling of knowing, and the actual choice of the brand in the ad. But it's very similar pattern, just a slightly weaker effects. So main findings, we believe, in fact, there's a question mark, but we try to not claim it too strong in the paper, but we believe that this is pretty much a new gold standard on the thin slicing conditions. We show that at least starting from 2 seconds, the event typical ad outperforms the product typical ad. So it's the first time there is a type of typicality that does better than product typicality. Also, it's very counterintuitive, the results, that dual typicality is not good. In fact, you don't accumulate the benefits. You really have to choose what you want to be typical of. So that's one main takeaway. What's also important is that we expand the theoretical understanding of how advertising typicality works. It's not just about ad short exposures. It's not just about do you feel you know what the ad is about. It's not just that makes you like the ad. There is also more meaning to that. There is a feeling of curiosity. There is transfer of attributes from the event. Okay. Of course, we tested this with sporting events. Sporting events have lots of attributes. If you tested that with other kind of events with maybe less salient attributes, maybe attribute transfer will not work, of course, right? But if you choose popular events, most likely you will benefit from attribute transfer. In the process of doing our revision, we were asked to rule out priming and fluency. I will spare you the details of that, but we tested it in 15 different ways, please the reviewers, and we could never find any support for either priming or fluency. So we believe they will stop nagging us with that. We'll see. And also what we find really interesting is that all exposure duration has a huge impact. Basically, it upends the hierarchy of ads, in just 1.5 second increment. So that's really a powerful, obviously, factor. And it's kind of obvious that exposure duration is super important in advertising, you would think. But in fact, very, very, very few studies, we did the review, so it's like 4 or 5 studies in the entire literature that manipulates exposure duration. Nobody manipulates it, it's just they let people look at the ad as long as they want. And also curiosity, here, it's interesting because curiosity is associated with people in psychology and marketing are really attached to these things called the congruity effect. It's a bit of a paradox because, in fact, when stimuli are incongruent, in fact, they tend to be liked a bit better than if they are too congruent or too incongruent. And people say, yeah, that's because of curiosity. And yes, curiosity works. We can see the product typical ad, the event typical ad is incongruent with the product schema. So, this effect is consistent with the congruity effect, but it's not the only process that emanates from incongruent stimuli. Attribute transfer is still there. And even the feeling of knowing for the event typical ad. So that's also theoretical expansion on about the congruity effect. Yeah. That's it for me. There's still a bit of time for question, hopefully. Sorry, almost 58. Thanks for your attention. I know it was a lot of content. Been working on this for 6 years, so way too long.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, and everyone online. Yes, if you